T-minus 30 seconds. T-minus 20 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Kush's Corner here on the Trap Talk Reptile Network, the coolest reptile network in the world. Tonight, I am back with another solo episode. It's been a long time coming. I haven't done a solo for a while. This is something I've been thinking about doing in an episode for a little while, and that is kind of going over some of the biggest and honestly hardest lessons I've learned in herpetoculture. For a few different reasons, maybe even one just to hold myself accountable to learn these lessons now that it will actually be out somewhere. But if it could help anybody who is newer in herpetoculture, or especially young people in herpetoculture, I think that would be absolutely wonderful. I'll get into those topics here in a minute, but as always, USARK. So USARK is the organization that is fighting for our rights to keep our reptiles, to run our reptile businesses, to live this lifestyle. Please check out usark.org for all of the information you need to know about the organization, and also for any news regarding legislation on local or federal levels that impacts all of us. Even local legislation really impacts all of us ultimately. If you are not already a USARK member, please look into becoming a member of USARK. The number of members is taken into consideration by these legislative bodies when USARK is lobbying a case on our behalf. So the more members there are, the more people behind the cause, the better. What's up, everybody? Good to see everyone here this day whenever you are watching or listening to the episode. If you are here on YouTube, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, the Trap Talk Reptile Network. There's a new podcast every single day of the week from some of the absolute best hosts in the game, talking about a wide variety of topics ranging in all corners of the reptile industry. So if you are a fan of the audio podcast reptile content, you have found the right place. But we are not only available on YouTube, we are on these streaming sites as well, audio streaming that is, be it Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your audio from. A follow and a 5-star review on those platforms would be absolutely wonderful. If you want to leave a comment on any of those sites too, that would be great as well. And we're here. So another solo episode. Like I was saying in the intro, it's been a long time since I've done one of these. They were a little bit more frequent back in the summer, late summer, fall time. I really had a great, lineup of guests so far this year that I've really, really enjoyed talking to. It's been incredible. But every now and then I like to do one of these solo episodes. Honestly, the main reason why I don't do more is I don't often have topics in mind for solo shows. So if anyone out there is interested in me potentially doing a solo episode on a particular topic, then by all means, shoot me a message, leave a comment underneath the video. The message will probably find me a little bit better though. And I'll definitely consider doing that. But for tonight, and this episode has been one that's been on my mind for a while, kind of the topic of the lessons that I've learned in this hobby that have been difficult, but ultimately will be kind of what ends up, shaping how I go about things. And it ultimately is just part of the learning curve, probably just of life in general, but particularly of this industry. And, as I've talked about on podcasts before, I think one of the things that makes my experience, I don't want to say unique, but different than a lot of people's experiences in herpetoculture, is just how young I started off in it. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but I just happened to have kind of some serendipity in my young life where becoming involved in herpetoculture was just available to me from a really young age. I mean, as young as 5 or 6 years old. And I had a lot of mentors in the area. I grew up in Chicago, which has one of the biggest, herpetocultural communities in the country. The Chicago Herp Society, the Wildlife Discovery Center back in the day was huge. 2 zoos with reptile departments in the city. And Brookfield Zoo is a little outside of the city, but nonetheless, I grew up across the street from the Lincoln Park Zoo, free zoo in Chicago. So I was over there all the time. And I learned about the industry side of things when I was about 8 years old, from primarily snake bites videos on YouTube, but not only snake bites, other channels like the videos that Ralph Davis would put out. A little bit later, when Justin Kabelka started making videos, people like Garrick DeMeyer. I could keep going on, but a lot of the people who were doing YouTube content early on about reptiles, kind of before the trend really took off. And that really got, the juices flowing for me. Like, this could be a profession. Like, that's the craziest thing I've ever considered in my life. And to me, the thought of being able to enjoy the reptiles, have this many of them, especially because that was the day when the dream that was being sold is giant facility with thousands of animals. And I think for the better, almost entirely, that's not quite the dream that's being sold anymore. And I've talked about this on some episodes with guests, even last week a bit with Logan Hope, about the change in philosophy in the industry, going away from large numbers, large facility, solid color racks, jam as many animals in a small space as possible, to focusing more on the individual animal. And I've talked in the past about how I think that actually could end up being a more profitable business model at the end of the day than the old school mass production scale. But again, that's not really what this episode is about. Just kind of for some context. So I had it in mind that this is what I wanted to do from the time I was about 8 years old. And, I pursued it pretty heavily, as heavily as a child can, who still is in school and plays sports and does somewhat of a normal kid-like, schedule with their life. But watching all the YouTube videos and stuff was, it was my life. It was what my weekends revolved around. After school, I'd get the email notifications when a new snake bites episode dropped, and I would watch it every, the same day. So stuff like that was just very important to me. And then around the time I was in high school, a little bit before, but primarily by high school, I started listening heavily to reptile podcasts when I found out about Morelia Python Radio and, all the other shows that were around during the time, a little bit predating that, the Herp Nation network. And, then that's when the information about the real stuff with the industry started to be more available to me. And, that information is available in droves these days, like on this channel in particular, but on many different platforms, real long form information about the industry from the people that are actually doing it is available now way more than ever. So I guess at that time, for me, I was kind of in a rush, honestly, to put it in so many words, to make this thing work, to make it happen. I'm going to be an adult and not that long, and I don't want to have to get a regular career to support my reptiles and have to put doing that off in order to make money, to provide for myself, to be in a comfortable position to be able to do the reptiles to begin with, which in hindsight was definitely not the mentality to have, and one that I would encourage other people, who are younger in this game, to not adopt as a mindset. Because not only did it affect how I, operated as far as my collection went and whatnot, it really affected my life as a whole. And, ultimately it's not like it was some terrible thing that happened to me, but I just think that it could have been balanced and have gone the way it did anyway. So I think the theme of the episode for me is going to be that of patience. And, especially when you're dealing with animals, nothing is guaranteed. Stuff happens on their schedule. Things go wrong all the time. These aren't machines, obviously. So there's a certain margin for error that you have to be able to accept. Doesn't make it easy. Doesn't make it any easier when that acceptance of the margin for error slaps you in the face over and over again. No matter how many times it has slapped you in the face, it still sucks. but it is just kind of what it is. So the lack of patience early on, I guess, led to me acquiring animals that were probably not the ones that I ultimately would have wanted to at the time if I could have done it all over again. Um, you know, when I acquire a new species, getting one male first because it's at a show and I can get it in a deal with something else, then and then never ending up, pairing that male up, or now I've set myself back multiple years on a project because if I had gotten a female first, ponied up a little more money, or just been patient and got a pair later on, then I would be in a more advantageous position to raise those animals up in a more timely fashion. Or with when I was breeding ball pythons, acquiring morphs that really made no sense for the direction that I wanted to go to with them. And I would say then even on top of that, once I started to get into the species that I ended up, staying with, like the scrub pythons or the other rare pythons I used to work with, like green trees or white lips, Timor pythons, olives, which I still have my olives. Um, you know, Seeing the writing being on the wall to probably stop doing the ball pythons, but that was also before I learned a lesson that I'll go into a little bit later about how more isn't necessarily always better and not going to lead to better results in your breeding. That's a really difficult one to come to terms with, but it sure happened to me. And I guess might as well just do that one now. I have a little outline that I wrote for myself, but I know that I'm going to be jumping all over the place throughout this show. Not even sure how long it's going to be, so I guess we'll see. But I would say probably based on that mentality that was the dogma of the time of, the late 2000s to really through the 2010s, but primarily earlier on in the decade of more is better, have as many animals as you can, breed as many as you can, you know, use your space to the most, to the greatest amount that you can to produce animals, to be able to sell more, to have more, all that stuff. I never really had a mentality, which I have now, fortunately, of my interests have taken a turn. My vision for what I want to do is taking a turn. Let's take a step back, analyze the collection as a whole, and then make some decisions based off of that. It was always, well, I'll just get this pair and it'll be over here. And now I'll have another potential thing I can breed on top of everything I already have this year. And I might just have more babies. And, while that is true to some degree, they're, just basically on mathematics, there's the practical application of that, and which is now your focus and your attention is being pulled in a number of different directions that are not all the exact same. Be it you are keeping, let's say you or me in, living with your parents. Obviously you're a teenager and you have, they let you have a room in the basement where you can have your reptiles. Well, that's one room. You can keep that climate one way because it's one room, and the animals that you have in there need to be able to fit within those parameters. Otherwise, things aren't going to work. Whether or not that means that they're not going to thrive, it certainly means they're not going to do the best that they possibly can, and some things probably won't breed as a consequence of that. So that room was very much like a great room for keeping, but not really a great room for breeding a whole lot of stuff. Fortunately, by the time I left home, I didn't really miss out on a whole lot based off of not being able to cycle different spaces in different ways. In that room, I was primarily breeding ball pythons and leopard geckos. I had a clutch of green tree pythons out of that room, which, was shoddy on the results, but still I got, 6 babies from a green tree clutch, which anybody who has messed with green trees knows that any success is good success with green tree pythons. But I know for a fact that, like, let's say now, if I had a pair of scrub pythons in that room that were adults, the ability to cycle them the way that I would want to now is something that wouldn't really be compatible with the other species that I had in that room, to where they would be getting too cold or whatnot, or I would be pushing food to animals that weren't, that didn't have the ability to digest properly based on their temperatures, and things would have been kind of messed up. So going into that, if I'm kind of peeling back in hindsight, I would have, and obviously I was a teenager at the time, so I can't be too hard on myself about that one. But it would have been nice to have a vision for the room before filling the room out, as opposed to what I kind of did of get stuff as I go, find a slot in the rack to put it, and cool, call it a day, not really thinking too much about enclosures down the line that they're going to need in a couple of years. Being very short-sighted on, I want this species. Oh, I can get this species. All right, here it is. I'm getting a good deal on this pair. Let's get it. Something else that I'll talk about. But then I think what could have worked was if at that time I was able to analyze the collection and make decisions on things I wanted to part with and keep, to then maybe mold that room into something that would have been a whole lot more functional for the species that I wanted to have in it. So to go back to the topic right now, is that of more animals not necessarily equating to a greater success rate. And if anything, it drops off significantly as you continue to add. The only real exception to this would be if you're running some sort of industrial scale type operation where, you're breeding ball pythons, leopard geckos, crested geckos, species that are, on the easier side to breed and are scalable in terms of how you can keep them and breed them. And then even still, those, a lot of those facilities, they're shooting for 50% of the females to reproduce every year, and that's a great year. So if you scale that 50% down, if you have 10 females of anything you want to breed that year, and you breed 5 of them, that's great. But if I only had 10, I'd want that number to be as close to 10 as possible. So you're really looking at a far different scale. And then also, as soon as you get to that larger scale, the number of species that you have will very much dictate that ultimate success rate that you have. And that's a tough one when you've invested money into something. It's a project that you're passionate about, a species that you're really interested in. And I know I'll give an example in a little bit of a species that I acquired without full knowledge of the biology of the snakes. And in hindsight, I never would have bred them in the way that I had them. They were doing fine. They were, they didn't have any issues, but their reproduction would have never occurred. So when this really struck me was when I had started working for Forrest Fanning, and I was not only managing my collection, I was managing his as well. And many of those animals ended up being in the same space as well. And I mean, shoot, in one room, there were probably 200 to 300 animals of probably 40 to 50 species, and maybe even more on the total numbers in that space. And it was chaos. It was not good for anything. The animals were able to be just fine. I bred my first pair of scrub pythons in that setup, but that not a whole lot else. Of all of those animals, I mean, shoot, be lucky if 10% of the females I attempted to breed every year bred. And that comes down to a lot of different things. One was the amount of time that would take. And I had help for sure with the animals. It wasn't entirely me. It was probably 70% on my shoulders though, to carry the load of the maintenance and the upkeep, the feeding. I was doing all the feeding, etc. And not only was it very difficult to balance all of that, it wasn't fun at all. It was frankly pretty miserable having to, be faced with this burden. You walk into the room and you see all of these animals and you're like, oh my gosh, this is entirely on me to take care of today. And this is not the only thing I need to do today either. And you look at your phone, you look at the time and you're like, oh man, I'd be lucky if I get through half of this work. And then you end up getting through a quarter of it because you're just dreading it the entire time. And, that's how work is in general. But when you're dealing with animals, you're not the only one in consideration. So you being unhappy is going to directly relate to a lower quality of care for those animals. frankly, I don't care who you are. If you're not happy, if you're overwhelmed, if you're stressed, you're not going to be the best keeper you can be. And I definitely wasn't at that time. So that was, a lesson that I learned, but slowly, because I didn't fully learn the lesson. As far as the sheer numbers went, that lesson was learned by then. I was probably about 19, and I'm like, wow, this is just not, like, I'm not enjoying doing this right now. And if you had asked me when I was 12 if I would ever not enjoy keeping my reptiles, I would have told you were ridiculous. That was, a ridiculous thought. So the fact that I'm even considering, that is my mindset right now, I need to do something to change that, not just for me, but for the animals as well, because, they're entirely relying on me in that, to be their caretaker. So the one thing that I did, which was the first time I had really done this, was that I sold off my leopard gecko colony. And that was one of the best things that I've ever done for my reptile care, as far as, what I was enjoying, the care for the animals, and really just everything overall. I love my leopard geckos. It was a lot of fun to breed them. That was the first project that I really had. When I was in high school, my dad would take me to some of the all animal expos in Wheaton, Illinois. And, for a teenager, I would have some pretty good shows. And, what I would make off of my leopard geckos helped me buy some of my scrub pythons and stuff like that. And, I produced some stuff that I was really proud of. They were really, really cool. Some, in my opinion at the time, some of the cooler stuff that I was seeing out there for leopard geckos. But I had also come to the point of understanding that this is not going to be my long-term goal project that I really want to, keep myself focused on, is going to be a main passion of mine. By this time by the time I sold them, I think just hatched out my first clutch of scrub pythons. And for me, I already knew that was going to be my thing, but that even more so solidified it, that this is the thing I'm really going to pursue heavy, are these scrub pythons. So I sold my leopard geckos, and I mean, shoot, that was probably in the ballpark of 150 animals. And it was, frankly, one of the best things that I'd ever done. And then really the first time that I had downsized anything for the sake of the rest of the group and for myself. And it was definitely hard. It was hard to see those animals go, but I found some solace knowing that they were going to be in a better situation, and so was I. So, and understanding that makes parting with some, with a project, with a pair of animals, with even an individual, it makes it a little bit easier to stomach, because frankly, I'm not going to speak for everybody, but I definitely get attached to these animals. But when I sell one and I see the person who acquired it put the snake in a really awesome big display enclosure with plants and lighting and all that stuff, and I knew that I was keeping it in a rack, I don't feel so bad anymore about having moved on from that animal. I probably would still want that animal, but I know that it was the best decision for both me and for that animal at the time. So to kind of continue this on to the further extent of really learning my lesson as far as this goes, I've always been super into diversity of species, and frankly tons of different stuff, particularly with snakes. I've worked with many different reptiles. I mean, at this point, probably a few hundred species of reptiles, and ranging from lots of snakes, obviously, lots of lizards, like monitor lizards, abronia lizards, a bunch of different stuff, crocodilians, even some invertebrates, or not invertebrates, amphibians as well. I used to keep dart frogs when I was younger. I really enjoyed that, but the hands-off nature of keeping dart frogs didn't quite appeal to me as much when I was younger. Obviously now I keep a lot of rattlesnakes and vipers, and those are entirely hands-off. So, I get my hands-off fix with them. But then obviously all of the pythons and colubrids and stuff like that, I'm very hands-on with those animals. And if I only had venomous snakes, I think I would completely lose my mind, not being able to physically interact with any of my animals. But For a while I was, acquiring a fairly diverse collection of a lot of different things, getting a bunch of monitors, colubrids, more pythons, uh, some boas, getting the scrub python collection really bolstered. But while I was building up the scrub python collection, it wasn't my exclusive focus. Acquiring stuff like indigo snakes, which I absolutely loved, and I want to keep indigo snakes again. I don't have any at the moment. Um, a bunch of other stuff. Lots of monitors, lace monitors and quince monitors, blue tail monitors, stuff like that, torch monitors, species that I don't want to say I had no business keeping, but I probably shouldn't have, knowing that they weren't going to be a main focus, and they were an animal that needed to be a main focus of some collection. And in hindsight, there's probably a little bit of selfishness to that. Not that I was poorly taking care of those animals. They were doing fine. They just weren't breeding. And I didn't have the ability to cycle them as far as temperatures and food goes the way that they would need to reproduce. And especially when you're talking about a rare species, uh, blue tails are not quite as rare, but rare to be bred in captivity. But especially something like a torch monitor, which are very few individuals in captivity of that species. And captive breeding is even more scarce than that. That's an animal that needs to be the number one focus for somebody who has it in their collection. And in hindsight, I don't think I would have acquired an animal like that again, um, especially where I am today. And, part of this also comes down to learning what you're interested in. And that took me a long time because, frankly, I'm interested in a lot of different things, and I'm still learning that now. But right now, my current collection, I don't have a single lizard. And I'm not sure when that will change. It'll inevitably change at some point. The first thing that I add back with legs will be crocodilians for sure. Not in the current setup I'm in, but hopefully, down the line, I can be in a situation that to me is more ideal for myself. I'll 100% have more crocodilians because those animals are just, they're literal dinosaurs, and they're super intelligent. They're the most amazing things in the entire world. But having only snakes for me right now is one of the best decisions that I could make, considering what I'm trying to accomplish as far as, having this continue to be my profession full time, as long as I see fit to do that, and that snakes are my primary focus. I know that the amount of time that I want to put into my snakes will not accommodate for lizards. Because one, geckos aside, bigger lizards, be it monitors, tegus, iguanas, etc., one of them is like 40 snakes as far as the amount of time you need to dedicate to it. And that's something that I learned the hard way of acquiring a larger monitor collection without really fully understanding what it meant as far as managing that to the best of my ability. And I personally think if you're not 100% dedicated to monitor lizards, um, or if you're not someone like Brian Susan, who has an entire section of their facility dedicated to, in instance for him, as tree monitors, you're not going to do as well with those animals from a breeding standpoint as you probably should. Someone like me, if I was giving advice to somebody who had a similar looking collection to myself, I would say start with one pair of monitors. If it's something you really are passionate in, or iguanas or whatever it may be, larger lizards, and just take that one slowly. See if you even enjoy it in the first place. Racking up a collection of 10 to 15 monitor lizards, realizing within a few years you don't want them anymore. That's you're in much worse shape than if you had started with two, especially when it comes down to how expensive they are to feed, how much space they take to house. And frankly, in a lot of cases, in my experience, I'm not sure how the market has changed since I've been out of it. People don't really want bigger lizards. They want babies. They want to raise them up from babies. So selling a 3-year-old pair of black dragon water monitors is almost impossible, when selling babies is a lot easier, because people want to have that, hand raised experience from a baby, and rightfully so. There's a lot of enjoyment, a lot of fulfillment to be derived from that experience. So to kind of bring myself back to center a little bit, I was acquiring these animals. And like I've said, I was a joint collection. There were other people that were helping out with it as well. So this wasn't entirely me, but mentally it's all there. Just because you have 2 or 3 people who are working on this collection doesn't change the fact that it's 400 or 500 animals. And managing how the care goes, how the breeding goes, how the feeding goes, on top of having a full-time job aside from it, it's just, you're going to compromise something along the way. And frankly, one of the things that I compromised was my well-being as a person. So again, it was just a process of learning how to downsize, how to focus. And a lot of that came into play when I had opportunities to really expand my scrub python group, in the form of buying a collection, essentially, of what was probably at the time the biggest collection in the US of scrub pythons. And that's something I will get to, probably not quite yet. But my gosh, if there was ever a learning experience that I've had in this industry, it was that experience right there. And I mean, it'll be worth it if other people can learn from it too, because it was a bad experience as a whole. Not entirely, but a lot of negativity for me came out of that experience. So, but on the topic of kind of the ebb and flow of focusing, being interested in focusing, one species that I had acquired that I had worked with in the past at the Wildlife Discovery Center, but in more of a zoological sense and less of a herpetocultural sense, was a Madagascar tree boa. And got a nice little group together, a trio of the mandarin phase and a pair of greens. And frankly, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say it, but until years later, I didn't even know that they needed a cycle similar to a diamond python. And the way that I was keeping them like any other boa or python, ambient in a room of about 80 degrees. They were doing just fine, but frankly, I'm not exactly sure, and I'm not the one who has the expertise, but that style of keeping could potentially, worst case scenario, shorten the animal's life. Best case scenario, they were never going to produce. And, for anyone who's aware of those species, those are not inexpensive animals, and they're not very common animals. So, and frankly, due to the fact that I believe still at the moment, Madagascar is not exporting. And even while they're exporting, I'm not even sure if that's a species that Madagascar has sent out for the longest time, particularly the green Sanzinia. For anyone who's aware of that market, which probably a good amount of people who are going to be watching or listening to this, they are just not available. They're one of the rarest snakes in the U.S. hobby. And they command a lot of respect. And the people who work with them are very, very passionate about those animals. And not that I wasn't, but I was too focused on get this, get that. Oh, these are so cool. I've wanted these for so long. Oh, there's a pair available. Oh, let's do it. I'll get it right now. And I didn't take the time in that instance to deeply research that species, because if I had, I would have understood that, okay, I can probably accommodate for them. I have a Montaigne room that at the time was primarily dedicated to Abronia. But I'll need to eventually, not even eventually, probably in the near future, figure out a solution to have those animals in that room where there's a cooler ambient, and have constant basking and figure out their winter cycle and all that stuff. So in an instance like that, my lack of patience led me to dropping a decent amount of money on some snakes that I wasn't even fully understanding of their husbandry, which is something that I hope I never do again. And like I said earlier, I'm almost a little bit embarrassed to admit it, but I was 20 years old at the time, and I'll give myself a little bit of forgiveness on that one. But I think, if anyone else can learn a similar lesson and not make that same mistake that I did, I think, there's value in that for sure. Because not only, like I've been saying, not only for you as a keeper, as someone who's investing in a project for those animals as well. And again, this was already when I knew that these scrub pythons were going to be the primary focus of my collection. So to acquire a species like Sanzinia that are difficult to breed, require some pretty specific husbandry parameters, and are not very common, may not have been the best idea for myself or for the sake of the project. So to kind of, conclude a little bit on this, with all that said now, my collection, depending on offspring and whatnot, roughly fluctuates between 200 to 300 snakes. Still a lot of snakes. And right now I think I have 40 species. So, I didn't fully go, balls to the wall on following what I've been saying this whole time, but considering that number at one point was like 110 species, I think I'm doing all right. But then of the 40 species that I have now, they fall into some pretty strict categories, that of scrub pythons, which at the moment is 4 species, and then colubrids. Of the colubrids, almost all of them fall into pretty similar care parameters. And then, at least as far as temperature goes, some have different humidity requirements, but that's a lot easier to control in an individual enclosure than temperature, especially if you have a rack system and whatnot. Anyway, and then the venomous. And with my venomous collection, people will ask me sometimes, oh, why don't you have any cobras, or why don't you have, gaboons or rhinos or whatever? And, the one answer that kind of, is so important that the other answers potentially don't even matter is that I don't have the capability of caring for those the way they need to. Same reason why I don't have speckled rattlesnakes is my venomous collection is purely montane, meaning that at the hottest point of the year, their ambient day temperature might be in the mid 70s and dropping still into the upper 60s at night. And during the very coldest part of the year, their nighttime may get into the upper 40s and their daytime might barely break 60 degrees. And that is a parameter as far as, a temperature that fits a very select, specific group of species. So if you want to keep a venomous snake, or any snake, but in my case, venomous, in that room, you're not keeping a tropical species in there. You're just not. Or even, for instance, like some subtropical species, like you're keeping high elevation, montane, desert, cloud forest, whatever it may be, but animals that thrive but also tolerate low temperatures. And my blinders are on with my venomous collection to anything that doesn't fall into those parameters. So, and it was pretty intentional in that way. But then what's nice for me, within that parameter and within the somewhat narrow focus, like with rattlesnakes, for instance, which is my, take up the majority of my venomous snakes, there's a lot of different species and a lot of different localities of these small montane rattlesnakes. And their care within a few degrees here and there is all pretty much the same across the board. So I can have all of them in my montane rooms and they'll do wonderfully in there. They'll do exactly what they need to. And then aside from that, I have my palm vipers, my Central American palm vipers, and then my Mengshan vipers, which are my only old world venomous. And with those species, the only real difference is maintaining a higher level of humidity for them. So that would, mean more enclosed as far as ventilation goes on the enclosures, more frequent spraying, et cetera, different substrate composition. So, those little minute differences are something that I can achieve within that space because they fit the overall temperature parameter of the room. I can manage humidity on a micro level in individual enclosures that I need to, but I couldn't keep ball pythons in there. I couldn't keep scrub pythons in there, and vice versa. If I kept those animals in my python rooms, they would never breed under any circumstances and probably not live a very long life, because these are snakes that are meant to shut down for almost half the year, go into a brumation like state, not eat, not drink for extended periods. Particularly in the case of the rattlesnakes, with the palm vipers and Mengshan vipers, I still maintain a level of humidity and moisture, whatnot, even through the cooler periods. But then also, dry out a little bit to stimulate cycles, et cetera, et cetera. So if I had those animals in my regular python rooms, they would never reproduce. They probably wouldn't do very well, and they probably wouldn't live very long either. So, learning the discipline of that has been very helpful for me to look at the overall picture of things. And, if I were to have gotten into that project 8 years ago, I may not have taken the time to learn about how to care for them, find mentors who showed me the ropes of exactly what to do. And, that became my secondary focus in my collection behind the scrub pythons is that of the venomous. And when I was acquiring stuff like what I was saying before, some of the monitor lizards, the Tanzania, the indigos and stuff like that, I'm not even sure where I could place them on a priority list, because when you have over 100 species, you can't really have a priority. You kind of just doing everything somewhat half-assed, and that isn't good for anybody. So I guess it might be a good place to move on to the next topic. But, and then I guess the ultimate theme of that would just be patience. I could have still, and may even still, eventually add something like Tanzania to my collection. But now I have more resources to learn about how to properly set them up and their care. I have rooms that would potentially be suitable for them. So then I would have to look into how I could, properly set up an enclosure within that space to do right by those animals. And then once all of the groundwork is laid, now here we go. In general, having an idea for your room beforehand as far as what you want to keep in there, what the temperatures you're going to need, what enclosures you're going to need where, how many animals can't even fill up the room at all, because when you have a baby rack full of snakes, that's super easy. When all those snakes are adults, oops, now they're a lot bigger. They need a lot more space. And, obviously that goes without saying, but oftentimes people like me, especially younger me, who were a little bit too impatient, probably needed someone in my ear. And not that I didn't, but I don't know if I was listening too well, saying like, hey, slow down a little bit. Like, you'll be fine. You'll get there. So I guess another thing to probably just add on in that moment is something that I've learned as well. Whatever you're looking at, it'll be available again. It might not be the same price. It may not be the same, frequency, but there are very limited instances in herpetoculture where you have a one-time opportunity to get a snake, and then you're not going to have that opportunity again. The opportunity might go and not come back for 5 years, but it's most likely not going to go away forever. I in this moment, trying to think of an instance where that might not be the case. Maybe a couple individuals, but generally speaking, there's never really a rush to get something 99% of the time. If the stars aren't aligning, you can't acquire this animal. It's not the end of the world. The opportunity will probably show itself again, and oftentimes quicker than you may imagine it. So I'm going to move on to another topic, but before we do that, I'm going to hit the commercials real quick. So stick around. We'll be back in a few minutes.
Sorry for the interruption, folks, but a quick word from our sponsors. One of the things I love the most about the reptile world is reptile businesses that are family-oriented. I love the Rice Reptile family. Rice Reptiles have made quite the name for themselves over the last couple of years, rebranding themselves and also bringing amazing cutting-edge, front-of-the-line ball python projects that you must check out. Again, make sure you head over to their website, ricereptiles.net, Rice Family Reptiles on IG, to give them a follow, see what they have coming out. You can catch them vending at all major NARBC shows, Southeast Reptile Expo. A lot of great stuff coming from this family. So again, thank you so much, Billy, Don, over at Rice Reptiles. If you're in the ball python game in 2025, you know what you should be doing with your sheds, and that's turning them in to get them tested. That's right. No more POS hets, no more 66% hets. We can find out directly through today's sponsor, and that sponsor is Rare Genetic Inc. Thank you so much, Ben and Sean over at Rare Genetic Inc. Head over to their website, raregeneticinc.com, and head over to their YouTube channel and make sure you subscribe to their YouTube channel. They put out a video every Wednesday to update you guys on new current events over at RGI. But I got to tell you right now, very excited to continue my partnership over at Rare Genetic Inc. Head over to their Instagram account. Make sure you follow them on Instagram, subscribe, hit that notification bell on their YouTube channel. That way you're current on new announcements and anything that they got to update you with. Again, thank you so much, Rare Genetic Inc. RGI, you guys are the best student in the game. Sorry for the interruption, folks, but a quick word from our sponsors. Green tree pythons, emerald tree boas, and plenty other arboreal snakes have been quite the popularity here at the Trap Talk Reptile Network, which brings me to today's sponsor, the Reptile Perch. Head over to the reptileperch.com and Reptile Perch on Instagram. See what type of design PVC perch is best for your arboreal reptile. But first and foremost, I would also check out David Brom's Green Tree Python availability on the website. And you can also check out his Instagram just to stay current on any projects or any productions that he posts. Thank you so much, David Broms, for your ongoing support. Looking forward to seeing what you have to show in the 2025 season. When you think about building a good community and being a leader of that community, nobody comes to mind better than Mark Hager over at Texas Chondros. That's right. Make sure you head over to TX Chondros on Instagram and also head over to Mark's website. See what he has available green tree python wise and be ready for quite the 2025 green tree python breeding season out of Mark Hager. He's a veteran in the green tree python game, one of the best and nicest breeders in the green tree python game. He's been putting on the whole state of Texas for as long as I've known him. So if you want to see all the amazing other chondro keepers out of the state of Texas, another good reason to go follow Mark Hager over at TX Chondros on Instagram. And again, head over to his website, texaschondros.com. You can find all the links in the description below. Thank you so much, Mark Hager, for supporting the trap. Treat.
All right, everybody, we are back from the commercial. So now to move on to another topic, and I kind of alluded to it earlier. And it's not going to be entirely around this one instance that I experienced, but I'll use it kind of as an example of this. So kind of the title I have written down is like, not every deal is a good deal. And it's something that you know, it's hard as a new person to newer in the industry to kind of come to terms with that, because you know, you get into the industry, you're really excited, you're acquiring animals, you're learning, you're making connections, you're making friends, things are going, you know, seemingly great. You're super stoked about everything that's going on. Unfortunately, within our industry, there are some people that are not as on the up and up as we would all like them to be. That's obviously not a shocking statement. But oftentimes, you know, you'll be offered a deal by somebody and you're like, oh my gosh, this person's being so nice to me right now. Why? Why? Well, that why is a very important why to come up. But oftentimes, you know, I've done this. I know other people have done this as well. You kind of ignore that and think, oh my gosh, this is incredible. I'm being offered these animals, this group of animals at this price. And not every deal is a good deal. Oftentimes, if a deal feels good, too good to be true, there's some underlying reason as to why it is. So, you know, I'm using this instance, but and I'm not going to. I'll preface it by saying this experience that I had wasn't entirely negative, because I was able to take these animals that I acquired, and you know, a lot of them, not a lot, but a decent amount, went on to produce some of my offspring that are now kind of the founder animals of what are going to be the future of my scrub python collection. But man, went through a lot of heartbreak and a lot of money to get there, frankly. So back in 2020, I was afforded the opportunity to acquire a large collection of scrub pythons. A keeper was getting out of them, and you know, I was offered them in a private setting before they went public at all. And immediately I'm like, should I try to get everything and keep what I want, maybe move on some animals that I don't need as much, but kind of make a real investment, like be really serious about what I'm doing with my scrub pythons. Because at that point I already knew, like, this is my thing within the industry. It's not the only thing that I'm going to do, but this is going to be my primary focus. So, and this keeper didn't have a bad reputation by any means. So, edit that in post. So, I went through with the deal, and the information during the deal was a little bit scarce. It was hard to get exact pictures and stuff like that. But at the time, it didn't really ring too many, or didn't really fly too many red flags for me, as far as maybe there's something not right here. And for as far as monetary standpoint goes, we struck a deal that was more than fair. The transaction ended up going in two parts, and this is the first part of said transaction. So it was a substantial transaction. The first one was, I want to say, about 50 snakes, and I got the animals, and I'm like, okay, cool, here we are. A couple things off the bat seemed a little off, but to me, it was like, okay, this is a lot of animals. They just made a big trip. Let's see what happens. Well, I mean, within maybe a month, one of them has a very noticeable spinal tumor that grew. I don't think the snake ate from me once. It died pretty quickly. So I'm like, okay, that was weird. And frankly, I didn't even make mention of it to the seller. And primarily in efforts because I knew that second portion of the collection may eventually become available. And that's where all the good stuff was. And I didn't want to burn said bridge before potentially being able to get some of these, irreplaceable scrub pythons. And time goes on a little bit, and more individuals are getting cancer and dying of cancer, and young snakes. And frankly, at the time of my life back then, I was super busy. I had a lot of animals, a lot of stuff going on in life, and it would happen, and it would be upsetting. But I didn't at the time think deeper about it than I was. Frankly, going off of this person having a good reputation, and maybe even thinking that I'm doing something wrong, and but then never being able to put two and two together as to what's actually causing these problems. Later on, I ended up acquiring the second portion of the collection, and an even more kind of contemptuous transaction. And frankly, by the end of it, I was kind of upset. But to me, I'm like, the sake of getting these animals is worth potentially some downside from a monetary standpoint, or being treated in a way that I wouldn't appreciate being treated in a deal. And by the end of the whole deal, it was probably 80 to 90 animals exchanged, and I hate to say it, by now almost half of them have probably died of cancer. And shocking, truly shocking stuff. Still, can't imagine why. We have, I've had theories. Friends who I've run this by have theories, but to me, in hindsight, this is why I bring it up, not to just bash this individual. Frankly, there's no reason to do that at this point in time, but because there's no way that wasn't something that the seller had knowledge of going into the deal. The most likely scenario here was that there was some sort of mass chemical exposure to these animals, or a sustained chemical exposure that would have been something to prompt early development of cancer in these animals. So, I mean, that first one that I talked about was sold to me with an active tumor that I just didn't catch right away, and very soon it overtook the snake. I mean, it even had neurological issues, and I had gotten some explanation like it wasn't an overheating incident, but it's even bred since that incident. Frankly, a fabrication. But and then that kind of goes into, is every deal a good deal? If someone's selling their collection off, why? And if the person isn't really willing to give you a why as to the reason, or reassurances far beyond what you could ever expect, there's probably something fishy going on there. Another thing that is an interesting subject to talk about, and it's not cut and dry, is that of as a customer of buying adult snakes. So this transaction was snakes ranging all, adults, babies, everything in between. But this goes back to that original topic of patience within the industry, within the hobby. Buying adult snakes can seem very attractive as a concept up front, and it's something that I have done. I've sold adult snakes, and I will probably continue to buy and sell adult snakes, but with there's just truth behind it as to there's a risk involved in buying an adult snake, and that is of you as a keeper weren't fully in control of how that animal was raised or cared for up until that point. In some instances, you're truly not sure how old the animal is, and then also in some instances, why is this animal available? So, and that could really make or break a lot of things. I've sold adult animals for a number of reasons. Everything from downsizing a project to focus more on another project, or trying to amass funds to invest in a new project. And I'm moving out a species that is lower down on my priority list. Hopefully, somebody who has it higher up on their priority list. That's one reason. That's a good reason to sell an adult animal. Another reason to sell an adult animal is that, let's say in an instance like with scrub pythons, and this is something that I have specifically done, is that I have an adult pair of snakes that have produced for me, and they're wonderful. They're wild caughts. But now I have my first generation of captive bred animals that are coming up behind them. I only have so much space. And for me, advancing my project with that is going to be within those captive bred animals, not necessarily the wild caught, former generation. So now I will part with those animals, but with full transparency as to what they are and why I'm doing it. So whoever is taking on these animals, frankly, know why I'm getting rid of them, and a little bit of background on these animals. Like, yeah, this is a pair that is produced for me, and this is where I acquired them from. This is about how old they are, all of that stuff. That's how you should do it. And then there's the other way to do it, which is being kind of vague as to why you're selling them in the first place. How old these animals are they producing well? If they are, especially if it's a species like an easier to breed colubrid or a ball python or something like that. Oftentimes people will sell off breeders once they're not very fertile anymore. They're having bad clutches or taking years off that the breeder doesn't want them to, etc. And I've sold animals like that as well, but then also with that caveat, or even sold as a retired breeder. So, especially when you're young, it's easy to be caught up in that excitement of, oh my gosh, this is an adult pair of this species that I have, and I want to breed them, but I don't want to wait 4 more years. It's something to really be careful about. And, frankly, there's not a lot, but a decent amount of species that I have now that if I had the opportunity to talk to my 19-year-old self, I would be like, just get a pair of babies and raise up a pair of babies. Like, some of my best breeding successes in my collection have been from animals that I have bought as babies. That I bought as babies and raised up to adulthood and bred. So there's there's a lot to be said about that. Like the two instances that come to mind primarily are that of my Mexican pine snakes and my blue beauty snakes. So just always be careful when it comes to acquiring adult animals. If anything, acquire them from somebody that you know and trust, and be able to have a backstory on the animals. And even more so than that, take it a step further. Wild caught adults, and you can't necessarily blame anybody for this. As far as from a seller standpoint, it's frankly a risk that is taken when you deal with imported animals. But with a lot of stuff that comes imported, the younger you can acquire the animals, the better. Even though you're going to think, I need to wait so many more years to breed this animal. Let's even say that the wild caught adult animal establishes and thrives and does eventually breed. Oftentimes it takes almost as long for that animal to settle in as it would to raise an equivalent animal from a hatchling. And then once both of them are at that reproductive age, now the one you raise from a hatchling has so much more of a reproductive life in front of it. Where let's say that animal is 4 or 5 years old. Now this imported adult that you got that's finally ready to breed, maybe it's 12 or 13. And at most you'll get 1, maybe 2 clutches out of that animal, where that younger individual you raised up might breed perpetually for you for the next decade or so. Obviously very species dependent as well on that. But when it comes to a lot of pythons, a lot of colubrids, that just is very much the case. It really is across the board with a lot of different reptiles. One big one that I experienced when I was a little younger was that of tree monitors. Especially with Forrest Fanning's collection of adults that he acquired wild caught. They just never bred. They were super skittish. They were nervous in the enclosure. They wouldn't put weight on. And then, animals that he acquired as babies were breeding by the time they were ready, as, should be normal. And then those older animals just never produced. So that short-term gratification, the chase of that with those wild caught adults ended up, coming back to biting at the end of the day, because those animals weren't really set up for success the way that they should have been. So, again, where patience becomes very important in a situation like that. But I guess, to go back to that, the original topic, I'm not going to just harp on my situation, but use it as an example where, it's something to be very concerned about, especially if you're a younger or newer person into the hobby. It's not necessarily age dependent, but, there's so-called, and not use this term very loosely, like so-called whale hunters out there, where you don't necessarily need to be a whale or someone with a lot of money coming into it, but enough to where somebody's going to want that money from you and, might track you down, pretend to be your friend, offer you animals that, will sound like a deal, but ultimately will either be setting you back from a project standpoint. Let's use the instance of like a morph heavy species like ball pythons or reticulated pythons. Someone might be pretending to be your friend, selling you morphs that are going to be obsolete by the time you're breeding them, and saying, showing you what might sound like a good deal, but ultimately they know that you'll never be able to make your money back on those animals, because by the time you're producing them, if you are successful, the market will have fallen to the point where those animals are worth very little relative to what they were originally. And now, frankly, that it just leaves a bad taste in your mouth with the hobby in general, but particularly that sector of the hobby. When you feel kind of screwed over by somebody, or you see that person retailing the animals a couple of years later for less than you paid on what was at the time a good deal. And, that's ebb and flow of the market for sure. But then there's also like kind of some predatory salesmanship in a way, something that's not uncommon in the hobby. So just be careful. Exercise that patience muscle as best as you can, as often as you can, and acquire young animals, get them from people who you can trust. If anyone seems overly salesy in this industry, there's probably a reason that they need to over market their animals, and the animals aren't just going to sell themselves. I'm not going to go into examples, but there's definitely, more than enough examples in this industry to look at in for that specific type of conversation. So, I think that's probably what to say about that. So a few quick ones to finish us out here. One that, we've done entire episodes on this channel on before, but one that, it fits perfectly with this topic, is that of breeding your own feeders. I think if you are going to do this on any sort of legitimate scale, be it full-time, part-time, even just self-sustaining, then if you're not breeding your own feeders, you better have a really good, cheap source somewhere close to you or that you can access, because that is going to be the number one expense in your business operation, so to speak, is that of your feeders, be it bugs or rodents. Obviously in my case with snakes, it's going to be primarily rodents and birds and stuff like that. Doing rats is obviously a big commitment for anybody, considering the amount of space they take. You just can't have them in your house. Rats are an operation, but something like mice or African softers, like what I do, is something you can do much easily on a small scale, have it, in your house, potentially in a well-ventilated area, and produce feeders for your animals that are going to be, for one, higher quality than you'll be able to get anywhere else, because they're, you're producing them in your own home and at a fraction of what it costs to buy them retail or really even wholesale. I don't produce all of my own feeders currently, but numbers wise, I probably produce like 80% of the total rodents I feed off. But those big rat sizes that I need to buy, the cost on those, they add up pretty quick. So if I was in a position where I could breed rats, I would 1,000% do that. It's just not currently practical for me, but hopefully it will be practical in the not too distant future. So that's just something that I always like to harp on. But even if you do lizards, having a dubia roach colony is super easy. Breeding mealworms or whatnot is really, really easy. So yeah, doing the feeders on your own is, to me, one of the most important things that you can do as a keeper. For anyone, on the rodent side of things, I would very highly recommend the roundtable episode that I did on here about a month ago, with, in my opinion, some of the best information on the internet as far as breeding rodents goes, especially in this context. So a couple other quick things to finish up on. One is, this is going to be primarily for young people, teenagers, early 20s, is that, if this is something you're really dedicated to, that's great. But I personally basically sacrificed my teenage years, my early 20s, for the pursuit of this hobby, of pursuit of herpetoculture. And, I did so because I felt like it was necessary in order to succeed in this way. And obviously to some degree, to truly succeed in something, you need to sacrifice in other areas of your life. But I'm just, looking back, I'm like, wow, I didn't need to do it as much as I did. Like, I could have done everything the exact same and still have managed some sort of life balance outside of it. And this might be more for me than for anyone else, frankly. But if you're a high schooler, if you're in college, and or of college age, and this is something that you are really passionate about, I would just encourage you to maintain at least some amount of a life balance next to it. And even if you want to dedicate a lot of time physically to your animals or to the knowledge, your pursuit of knowledge of this, learning about the industry or just the animals themselves, keep something else in there as well. Keep a social life, keep good relationships with your family, etc. And because burnout in this industry is real, as is with a lot of things in life. But then when you do experience burnout, it's not only at your expense, it's at the expense of animals too. And that's something that is very important to consider. So, just a quick little tidbit to throw out there. And then the last thing that I have down here is the topic of social media. So, as is very much a topic in life these days, is, of how social media is pretty much just like a fake image of what, life could look like. And, there's a lot of reptile influencers who everything looks like sunshine, rainbows, and butterflies on their pages. And then you peel the curtain back and it's like, oh, geez, that's not very good. And that's not everybody, obviously. But and it's not even always necessarily that it's not looking good behind the curtain, but that the the reality of what we do is not happiness 24/7. It's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of sometimes loss, some pretty hard negative feelings. There could be other circumstances in your life that make you not even want to open your reptile room that day, and nonetheless take care of your animals and stuff like that. And that stuff is never shown online. So it's something to just kind of keep in mind. You could see somebody think that they're far more successful than you, or have a better collection, or whatever the metric you're using social media to measure is. I would probably say in every single instance, the perception that you're seeing on there is not lining up with the reality of that person's life. And that, frankly, in a lot of instances, they might want to exchange something with you in your life that they would be envious of, but they're not seeing it because it's just not something that looks good for social media, or whatever it may be. I've been very fortunate to know the people who are at the very, top of the mountain when it comes to this stuff. And it's not always, it's not always sunshine and rainbows, and not everything is always, happy and great all the time. Even people who are very successful, running a business with a lot of overhead and employees and whatnot, that takes a huge toll on you. It's very difficult. So, it's a lot, and social media can make things not look that way. So, I guess also part of maybe this episode too is to try to, try to show some of that as well. Try to bring some more, reality to what we're doing, and even, on a very small scale here. Not a lot of, I don't get a ton of viewership or whatever compared to a lot of other types of, content creators, so to speak, in the reptile world. But hopefully this can be of some sort of positive impact in one way or another. But yeah, I would just say, to wrap up that quick little topic, just, it's really easy to get discouraged by stuff that you see on the internet. Someone who's like doing a whole lot better with the breeding than you are, or was able to get a species that you've always wanted. We're all ultimately in this together. The success of everyone just compounds on itself and raises all of us up. So, there's always instances where if someone's an overall negative to the industry, okay, that's one thing. But just petty jealousy or whatever doesn't get you anywhere, doesn't get the industry anywhere. So to be able to, be happy for one another, to be uplifting to one another, is always something that it helps everyone at the end of the day, ultimately. So I would just say, in this industry, be patient, enjoy every step of the process, always looking towards some sort of end goal, and not being happy with what's going on in the day to day is going to greatly diminish your enjoyment of the industry. And, it's not all rainbows and butterflies, but it can be, can be the most important thing in your life, like it is to me. So I guess, might be a good point to wrap up the episode on. Well, thank you guys for tuning in to this solo show. Hopefully anyone who listened derives some sort of positivity from some of my ramblings. You can find me on Instagram at Scrub Shepherd, Stephen Kush on Facebook, Kush Reptile, or Stephen Kush on YouTube as well. I drop a new video every single Friday. I'm Kush Reptile on MORPH Market as well. And of course, I am here every single Wednesday, Kush's Corner, on the Trap Talk Reptile Network. Take care, everybody. See you all back here next week for a new episode.